With Immanuel Kant, we then have an early signal of a change in strategy among religiously minded thinkers toward no longer trying to accommodate reason, but rather going on the offensive against reason, and a reintroduction of the idea that what is needed to defend religion in the modern world is a reinvigoration of a certain kind of faith. So it's faith versus reason. Fast forwarding to the next generation, now going on into the early part of the 1800s, I want to focus on Soren Kierkegaard. In my judgment, the most influential theologian of the past 2 centuries, and a name that anyone interested in religious matters should know something about. Kierkegaard was a Danish thinker, though he was educated in Germany. He was educated in a Germany that was largely dominated by Kantian and post-Kantian Kantian philosophy. So he was very well versed in Kantian themes and the variations that were prevalent in Germany at the time. When he went back to Denmark and proceeded to do his own philosophical and theological work, this issue of the centrality of faith and making faith again a live option in the modern world is the central focus of Kierkegaard's writings. And I want now to turn to a quotation from Kierkegaard to indicate the strategic approach here as he sees it. All right, so here's the quotation. Quote, "For whose sake is it that the proof of the truth of Scriptures is sought? Faith does not need it. It must even regard the proof as its enemy." Okay. Now Kierkegaard is making 2 points here in this quotation about faith. First, on the one hand, he is saying, if you have faith, whatever faith is, you do not need proof. Right? So proof is, in a way, irrelevant to faith. All of the things that go on in proof, issues of evidence and classification and experiment and analysis and logical argumentation, all of that is completely irrelevant for a person who is a person of faith. But he's also saying something stronger, and that's in that tail clause there where he goes on to say, faith has to regard the proof as its enemy. That is to say, it's faith versus reason, or faith versus the whole apparatus of proof. And you have to make a choice. Are you a person of faith or are you a person of reason? That's the dilemma of the modern world, and the only dilemma that has to be faced squarely if religion is going to have a chance in this new modern world. Now, Kierkegaard does not make claims for priority on these theological matters. He sees himself as part of a long tradition, a tradition that has been eclipsed in the modern world, particularly in the 1600s with the rise of science, on into the 1700s with the rise again of natural theology. But it's a tradition that must be reinvigorated if religion is going to survive in the modern world. And so Kierkegaard explicitly harkens back to Luther. Kierkegaard is more of a Protestant thinker than anything, although there are some overlaps with Catholicism and Judaism and Islam and the epistemologies there. But Kierkegaard does explicitly harken back to Martin Luther at the beginnings of the Renaissance, or the Reformation rather, in the 1500s, as making the exact same epistemological point about the centrality of faith and the dangers of letting reason in the door even the slightest bit. So here's a quotation from Martin Luther, quote, "Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. It struggles against the divine word, treating with contempt all that emanates from God." So there's no accommodation possible. That's my interjection there. Carrying on the quotation, "The virgin birth was unreasonable. So was the resurrection. So were the Gospels, the sacraments, the pontifical prerogatives, and the problem of life everlasting." All right, so now notice what Luther is saying here. He's saying that it is a reason versus faith battle, and he's saying that reason is the greatest enemy that religious faith has. So it's the enemy that has to be taken on and defeated soundly if religion is going to survive here. But he's also saying that there's no accommodation possible here. And he's making this very strong statement about the virgin birth and the various sorts of sacraments. He is saying explicitly that they are unreasonable, right? That they don't make sense, that they are contradictory. There is no fancy way, if only we think clearly enough about it or get more data, to make sense of the virgin birth, or to make sense of the sacraments that say, here, take some wine, have the priest say a prayer over it, and now you're drinking Jesus' blood. There is no way in reason for that to make sense. It is contrary to all reason, contrary to all evidence, contrary to everything that we know naturalistically about the world. And the only reason Luther says that we have any sort of a problem with this is that we think reason matters. And reason, in his view, is the great disease of the modern world. So it's the thing that has to be extirpated. Now, Luther himself does not think that he is being especially original in making this epistemological point. He's using this point to criticize the Catholics, who he thinks have become too worldly, too sold out, too accommodating to reason and the Renaissance way of thinking about things. And so he is calling for a reinvigoration of what he thinks of as an older, truer religious tradition that goes right back to the very foundations of Christianity. Next quotation I'd like to read you from Tertullian, one of the patristic fathers, or one of the early church fathers, early in the days of Christianity, formulating its orthodox doctrine. The famous quotation here from Tertullian in the Latin is "Credibile est quia ineptum est," or loosely translated, "I believe it because it is absurd," or "I believe it because it is impossible." Now, Tertullian is writing in the later part of the Roman Empire. There are lots of pagan religions kicking around. There's lots of pagan philosophies kicking around. Christianity is struggling for its place at the table and hoping for supremacy there. But it's very much part of the intellectual milieu of the time, and of course it's being criticized for all the reasons that people traditionally have criticized Christianity. The pagan philosophers and all the various other religions would be saying to Christians, you say, what, you believe that God is one, but you also believe that he's three, you also believe he died, he came back to life, you believe that bread wafers can be turned into flesh, right, and that virgins give birth, right, and so forth. It's all ridiculous, it's all absurd, it's all contradictory, it's all impossible. And Tertullian's point, rhetorically, is to say, yes, of course it is impossible. It is irrational, and that's precisely why I believe it. That's what faith consists in. And so the tradition then that Kierkegaard is hoping to reinvigorate is the same tradition that Luther is hoping to reinvigorate, and it's the tradition that back in the early days of Christianity, Tertullian and the others were urging upon Christianity as its only hope of salvation against all of the more reason-friendly philosophies and religions of the time. Now again, Tertullian is not making claims of originality here about epistemology and the centrality of faith to the Christian religious tradition. And he, like any good Christian, will say, if you want to know how to be a good Christian, of course, you go back to the source, and the source is Scripture. And in Scripture, you get all of life's lessons about all of the important things, what it means to be a good person, the right things to believe, the right things to do, and so forth. And if we want to know the right epistemological lessons, then of course we should go back to Scripture to get the right lessons there. And the lesson that Tertullian tells us to go back and read is the same lesson that Luther tells us to go back and read. It's the same lesson that Kierkegaard tells us to go back to read. It's the story right in the very first book of Scripture, the book of Genesis. It is the story of Abraham. And the argument is that if we want to understand what faith is, there is no better place than to go back and reflect on the story of Abraham. Abraham gives us the true story of what the virtue and the practice of faith involves, and this is the only thing that can save Christianity in the modern world.